Gentlelady from Pennsylvania is recognized for any questions she might have for the panel.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As one of the members of Congress who has the honor of representing Philadelphia as the birthplace of both our nation and the Constitution, I take particularly seriously references to what the Constitution does and does not require. And I have to agree with the ranking member that none of these sham impeachments brought by the MAGA majority in this Congress appear to be led by constitutional scholars. When the framers gathered in Philadelphia to write the Constitution in 1787, they spent months passionately drafting and debating the contours of that document and our new republic. They created a government by and for the people, laying out distinct branches and a system of checks and balances. And while they deemed it necessary to give Congress the power of impeachment, the framers were clear from the outset that they believed impeachment would be limited to situations that were extraordinary, solemn, and rare. If Marjorie Taylor Greene and her colleagues cared about the founding of the Constitution, then they would be familiar with the debates from 1787, when the framers debated what would qualify as impeachable offenses. They rejected the idea that impeachment could be used for malpractice or maladministration or neglect of duty, saving that most extreme sanction for instances involving bribery, treason, and high crimes and misdemeanors, a term which has a special constitutional meaning. They would know that Hamilton warned in Federalist 65 of the danger that impeachment might be driven by animosities and factions, and cautioned that, and I quote, "there will always be the greatest danger that the decision to impeach will be regulated more by the comparative strength of the parties than by the real demonstrations of innocence or guilt." And isn't that what we have here today? A cynical, partisan impeachment divorced from real evidence of innocence or guilt, brought solely to score cheap political points. It is outrageous, and real constitutional scholars and the American people know it. The truth is that for more than a year, House Republicans, in the chokehold of some of their most extreme members, have been jonesing to impeach somebody, anybody, in this administration. They've been guided not by constitutional scholars, but by the demands of the disgraced former president and his most shameless and servile followers. Even if all of the allegations in this resolution were true, which they are most certainly not, there's nothing in this impeachment resolution that rises to the level of an impeachable offense. Instead, we have a naked political ploy to smear a dedicated public servant because the House majority and former president would rather campaign on border issues than solve them. And frankly, I'm sad to say, coming from this majority, that's hardly shocking. The weaponization of our Constitution and the impeachment process over policy disputes after the MAGA majority has refused to engage with bipartisan proposals and requests for resources is unprincipled. It is shocking to see members of the House using solemn constitutional powers to intimidate public servants, to take down political rivals, and to undermine faith in the integrity of our country's institutions. Not for the first time in recent years, members of Congress must decide where their loyalties lie. Is it to the oath they made to be faithful to our Constitution, or is it with the former president and the MAGA extremists who run this House? Because that is the choice presented by this resolution. I hope that this time our colleagues find the courage to choose the Constitution, but based upon the proceedings so far, I fear that they will not. Ranking Member Thompson, I understand that the Committee on Homeland Security took testimony from a number of leading nonpartisan constitutional scholars, which you reported in your dissenting views on HRES 863. That testimony echoed that of scholars who've testified in past impeachment hearings. Can you talk a little bit about the constitutional standard for impeachment, and what did the scholars say to the committee?
Well, thank you very much. We had witnesses before the committee that basically said that impeachment is not a tool that can be used as a penalty, but it is clearly an extraordinary remedy under the Constitution, it's not a tool for policy or political differences. The framers also never intended for the legislative branch to wield its impeachment power to extort political changes from the executive branch. And so what we heard during our hearings is just the opposite of what the framers intended and what the testimony we heard from expert witnesses before the committee. And just a reminder that the federal government has wide discretion on how to enforce the laws. The Supreme Court has not found till this day that Secretary Mayorkas has broken any law. So for whatever reason, the high crimes and misdemeanor accusations have not been proven. And so we take the position in opposition to this impeachment resolution because of that.
I mean, it is remarkable to know what is in the constitutional debates, to hear what leading scholars say, both in the testimony that you heard and in testimony we've heard in recent years, including from Jonathan Turley, for example, who is brought to us repeatedly as a Republican expert, saying that what is alleged here is not high crimes and misdemeanors, does not constitute impeachable offenses. So this is a political ploy in search of a justification, and it certainly doesn't meet the constitutional standard.
We disagree as Democrats and Republicans all the time. I think it's how ultimately things become law. Those disagreements are discussed. But at this point, where we are moving with this impeachment is far beyond what the framers intended. And I think it's being used to satisfy some extremists in the other party for the wrong reason. We can differ. I've been on the committee ever since it was created, and I've never seen the committee move in this direction. Historically, we've been very bipartisan. The legislation the chairman is referring to in terms of House Bill 2, we would not allow any amendments or anything as it related to the committee. I mean, it just rammed it down our throat. And that's not who we are. When the enemy shows up, they don't ask party, they don't ask anything. They just want to harm Americans. And I would long for the day for that kind of leadership to come back to the committee so we can start continuing to protect the greatest country in the world, as well as the best and finest citizens that I know, and they are Americans.
I think many people across this country and across this Congress share your desire to see this place function as it's meant to be, and without it being based on bullying and my way or the highway. Zero-sum game doesn't work for Congress. It certainly doesn't work for my constituents, and I appreciate your testimony. I yield back.
Thank you. Gentlelady from Minnesota is recognized for any questions you may have for the panel.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I don't even know where to begin. I am sitting here listening to the other side of the aisle talk about impeachment as a political stunt and other various things that they're calling to discredit it. I was trying to take a few notes talking about cynical, politically driven impeachment, purely political, and it just seems very odd coming from that side of the aisle after what we've witnessed the few years before we were in the majority. Given that, Chairman Green, they're saying all this and they're saying it's driven by policy differences, but what you have developed a clear case of willfully failing to enforce the laws Congress has tasked the administration with carrying out. And when Congress instructs the executive branch through legislation, is abiding by the instruction optional?
No, it is not. And it is the law of the land when we pass it, and they have a responsibility. As I mentioned before, the Iran-Contra hearing where Democrats said the president doesn't get to pick and choose which of these he wants. It's interesting, this memorandum from Secretary mayorkas directs DHS employees to violate the law in terms of detaining criminal felons. The law is very specific. It even lists the types of felons. And yet here he told ICE that is not a reason to detain. And those individuals are basically directed by the secretary to not detain them when they're criminal felons. Now, we're not talking about just people who violated the law coming in. We're talking about criminal felons. So that is contrary to the laws this body passed and actually listed the crimes. He doesn't get to pick and choose. And so, yeah, it's not optional. And thank you for asking the question.
And I was going to ask you if you had examples that you wanted to put on the record, and you had it right there in writing. So I appreciate that.
Sure.
Because of your investigations, you are able to have the proof that you need to proceed. And I find it just ridiculous that they continue to call this a political stunt and all kinds of things, because you have the proof that you need. You have done your investigation, you have done your work, you have made a solid case, and I appreciate that. And if there's anything else you have to add that I know there's going to be a few more questions, but if there's anything else, because I am so disappointed that that's the tack that my colleagues have taken from the other side, and so I want to make sure that you are able to say anything that you want to in defense.
Sure, this notion about what the framers intended, and I actually have a quote from Federalist 65, but I really want to go, I know y'all's evenings were very busy, so I'll go straight to the guy who helped write the Constitution, Mr. James Madison. When he ran for Congress, became a congressman, and they were debating the formation of what would become the State Department. And the debate on the floor of the House was, well, what if we create this department, what happens if an untrustworthy person gets in the job? And this is what James Madison said: if an unworthy man be continued in office by an unworthy president, the House of Representatives can at any time impeach him, and the Senate can remove him, whether the president chooses to or not. The founders insisted that Congress has an ability to impeach unworthy cabinet officials, not just presidents. Public officials who refuse to comply with the laws of Congress and breach the public trust are exactly the type of unworthy men that James Madison called them, who were, worthy of impeachment. Our investigation found at least 7 laws where he's disregarded this co-equal branch of government. 40 plus times where I've sent requests for information, he's just refused, not even responding to the oversight responsibilities that we have. We asked him 4 different times to come before our committee. He said no or evaded. Judicial rulings have said cease and, to stop doing certain things, and he's ignored those court rulings. The separate branches of government was set up by our country to prevent tyranny, by our founders to prevent tyranny. And yet he's just operating however he wants to. Contravening the laws, disregarding court orders. That's not what we should expect from a cabinet secretary. And it is why I'm passionate about this. Thank you.
And I appreciate that, Chairman Green, and it truly is disappointing that our colleagues don't recognize that, and they can't see the facts there you've got on paper, that you've talked about the judicial proceedings. And so it's very disappointing that they won't actually help us with this and make sure that the laws are followed. And with that, I yield back.
Thank you. Gentlelady from New Mexico is recognized for any questions you may have for the panel.
Thank you, Chairman. So we're back here again with extreme Republican politics of grievance and acrimony, chaos over governance. So what I want to do, though, is make sure that we don't become numb to this kind of behavior and to this kind of legislating. Because we must condemn political vengeance and Trump's desire for political revenge every single time it rears its ugly head. when MAGA Marjorie Taylor Greene, as you pointed out, files 10 impeachment proceedings and censure motions, we should say no. Reasonable Republicans should say no. And indeed, as our ranking member pointed out, reasonable Republicans have said no. Former Homeland Security Secretary, as you pointed out, said that the Republicans have failed to put forth evidence that meets the bar. Ken Buck, one of your colleagues, said this is a policy difference. Over and over again, we're hearing that there is a distinction and policy differences do not rise to what the Constitution calls for with impeachment. And to talk about unworthy men is precisely an issue that then James Madison went on to define. So I would point out that after that discussion was had, there was an attempt to say maladministration. So we don't like your policy, right? Maladministration should be a cause for impeachment. So, Chairman Green, your point about unworthy, James Madison himself argued against allowing maladministration or policy differences for being a point of impeachment. He said, James Madison, and I would quote this, as he sought to defeat that Constitutional Convention amendment, he said, that would be equivalent, quote unquote, equivalent to a tenure doing pleasure of the Senate. There was indeed an effort to make sure there was a separation of powers. So as our ranking member Thompson pointed out, if you don't like what they're doing, take them to court. If you don't like what they're doing, there are remedies unless it is treason, bribery, or high crimes and misdemeanors. So the Constitutional Convention rejected a vague standard of simply unworthy, and instead, I would hope that my reasonable Republicans would also reject this attempt. And I think it is very different than what we've pointed out has happened before. Ranking Member Thompson, I need to tell you that I am so grateful for the work that you did as chair of the January 6th committee, because you shone a bright light for all Americans to see on prime time and in detail how close we came, how close the insurrectionists came to the members of Congress, some of whom are sitting here today, and our staff, how close we came to allowing a president who had lost an election, who knew he had lost election, from staying in power. And I know from watching you in those hearings how much you believe in our democracy, how much you have worked, as you pointed out, during your entire tenure. The entire time there's been a Homeland Security Committee, you've been on it. So share with us a bit of what you see when you look at what happened around January 6th and how close we came there and what we're looking at now with this mayorkas impeachment.
Well, thank you very much. I think that, there are sharp differences between this sham impeachment and the work of the bipartisan January 6th Select Committee. The Select Committee uncovered actual crimes committed by the former president. In fact, he's facing trial for some of them in federal court and in Georgia right now. Those are clearly impeachable offenses. Republicans cannot allege that Secretary Mayorkas has committed any particular crime, let alone a high crime and misdemeanor. Instead, they're relying on vague and poorly written charges. The other comment I make is that in reviewing Secretary Mayorkas' enforcement guidelines that was referred to earlier, the Supreme Court recognized that setting immigration enforcement guidelines is necessary and common. They sided with Secretary Mayorkas 8-1. So they're saying you have to use the discretion of the secretary to administer the laws. It's not a, here it is, you have to do the best you can with it. And it's that discretion that the court says the secretary has, and it continues to rule in that favor. So again, there's no bribery alleged against Secretary Mayorkas. There's no documented high crime or misdemeanor, as we have had in other impeachment settings. So again, it's people saying we're going to impeach him and not using any facts that will hold up in a court of law. Obviously, the impeachment will go through the House, and if it passes, it will go to the Senate. But it's so unfortunate that the last time we even brought it up was 148 years ago. And here we are at this point, 148 years later, with what a lot of us think is, in fact, a sham impeachment. We can work it out as Democrats and Republicans, but the die was already cast before we even considered any of the other so-called charges. One of the things I can tell you, I offered a simple amendment that the secretary be afforded due process. And I was ruled out of order. And then I offered an amendment in the markup, and it was defeated. I mean, that's how we as a country got to our greatness, is assuming that everyone has an opportunity not just to face his or her accuser, but also have an opportunity to provide a defense. We made that effort to just set some ground rules consistent with the rules of every other impeachment hearing, and it was failed. So it was clear when due process failed in the markup, I knew democracy was in trouble.
Democracy was in trouble. And I think that that's part of the concern, is that when we are using impeachment process rather than elections, policy issues are for elections, that we are using this impeachment process for something that's not intended. And, the chairman referenced the Belknap impeachment. Bribery. What was the real reason why Belknap was impeached? It was bribery. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Is that correct?
Are you asking me?
Bribery.
Actually, the third article was his failure to do his job.
Well, but
There were 3 articles of impeachment on him. There were crimes, you're right.
Right.
But
What-
clearly
can
our
you-
founders
can you
did
share
not
with-
intend
can you
for it
share
to be
with-
just
Can you share
crimes.
with us? Can you share with us what the crimes were?
Bribery.
Bribery. So in that instance, he was getting a cut from a trader. Is that correct? And
Well,
he was living a lavish lifestyle, big parties, had
doubt.
lots more money than his salary would have intended.
No doubt.
Yeah. So he was engaged in bribery.
He was. He did
engaged in
engage in a crime, but they also put a third article on there for failing to do his job.
But the real issue was bribery.
And President Nixon didn't commit a crime himself, but had several impeachment articles against him for being dishonest and for not following the law.
So, but as we know, using Belknap, who engaged in bribery, using President Nixon, who, while I actually agree with some of the actions President Nixon did as policy, amazingly, he did some very good things. To use Nixon as an example, when he resigned
I'm using the
in
example
disgrace,
of the impeachment people going against him, not Mr. Nixon.
Nixon resigned in
Just to be
disgrace.
clear.
But I would ask, besides, so talking about bribery and the salaries, besides the salary as a public servant, did you receive any testimony that Secretary Mayorkas received any financial benefits? Chairman?
No, that's not in the article.
Okay.
The articles are
So-
about him violating the laws passed by Congress with his
And-
memos and other things.
Yeah.
That's not even in our article, so
Right.
no, of course not.
Well, yeah, of course not. There was nothing like that.
Yep.
Professor Deborah Pearlstein testified in her testimony, right, ranking member? She says impeachable offenses against the public trust or instances in which an official is willfully acting for his own benefit or his own power or foreign power. And she found no evidence of any financial benefit flowing for him, no political benefit. In fact, our ranking member has pointed out that this is a thankless job, that he took on a job for which he has been attacked daily out of his love of this country. So I'm struck by a floor speech from the Republican chairman of the Subcommittee on Immigration, Integrity, Security, Enforcement, Republican Tom Clintock, who described this attempt to impeach Secretary Mayorkas as a, open quote, perilous path. He said House Resolution 863 would, open quote, utterly destroy the separation of powers at the heart of our